Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Very welcome to our post-budget webinar. There are many of these, but to us, it's important to get this information to you ASAP after the budget. Today, I'm joined by Professor Richard Calland to discuss the bigger context of our national budget. And hopefully a little bit later, we'll be joined by the Deputy Minister of Finance, Dr. David Masondo. This budget was, as always, a classic balancing act. Our country has several social requirements. Right now, I think most would say that the country is suffering somewhat of a crisis of confidence, and that is mostly brought about by our current energy crisis. And so a Minister of Finance needs to get up and solve on both sides of this equation. This happens in the context of a globe with heightened geopolitical risk, tighter monetary conditions, and undoubtedly slowing global growth. Our fiscus have been blessed and been fortunate over the last 3 years, literally since COVID, to have very positive tailwinds as higher commodity prices helped revenue grow strongly and in excess of what was expected and budgeted for at the time. That helped us to cover for a lot of the unbudgeted expenditures that we incurred and allowed government to extend several grants, which was undoubtedly, from a social perspective, very welcome. Now, as we get to the end of that phase, many of those tailwinds are now disappearing, and hence the budget exercise becomes tighter and tighter. Add to that the big elephant or the big E in the room in South Africa right now, and that is the situation around Eskom, not only operationally, but specifically in this context, financially. Now, in the MTBPS in October, we expected government to say a lot more about their plans for solving Eskom's problems. And at the time, you would remember we were very critical because very little to nothing was said at the time. Today was the exact opposite. Crystal clear, well laid out, and in fact, 2 hours after the budget speech, an international investor call by National Treasury and senior Eskom officials, handling calls from us as the investor community, very honestly, openly, transparently, backed up by documentation. It was excellent. So we'll get to that in a little bit in a while, but within that context, I think I'll hand it over to Richard to maybe, talk about the context within which we arrived at this point in time and specifically today's budget.
Well, thank you very much, George, and good afternoon, good evening to everyone on this call. It's a great privilege, George, to be working with you again, to have an opportunity to reflect so soon after the budget speech, when it's very, very fresh. Of course, all of us are still digesting the budget speech, but to me, there are 2 or 3 really big takeaways, and they are in the area of risk and opportunity. There was an immediate reaction from some political parties, including the DA, who said that it was a budget speech that was not bold enough. In many ways, it's a budget speech, George, in my mind, that has 2 very significant areas of boldness or risk-taking. The one is in the area of the social wage, as we call it. In other words, the bundle of welfare payments that go to the poorest folks in our society, of which, of course, there are many and a growing number. And the political risk around that socioeconomic, precarity is a risk that we all bear in different ways, and the economy bears. And one only has to look at the drop, what I call the dry tinder of that socioeconomic precarity, which of course was lit aflame in July 2021, to recognize it as a risk factor. So the welfare payment system is really important for socioeconomic stability and for a healthy business environment and a healthy investor environment. And what was striking was that the government today basically said two things. One, we still haven't made up our mind about that overall package in terms of a long-term solution. They talked in last year's budget, and you'll remember, George, we had the Minister for Finance on the day after the budget last year in a Citadel Financial Mail webinar, and Minister Godongwana said in answer to a question from me that he would be continuing to think about this, and that in October in the medium budget, the middle term budget, he would announce something that represented a longer term solution in terms of welfare payments. Well, here we are, October's come and gone, another budget comes and gone, and still it's temporary measures. We have the temporary, again, extension of the special grant at the same level as before. So no inflation link, 350 Rand a month. It's the same level it's been since its inception during COVID year, 3 years ago. And a cut in that line item of 9 billion Rand. So that inevitably is a risk. You are cutting your welfare payment, your social security safety net to the most vulnerable members of society. And you're using that money for other things. And then, of course, the equation, the calculation for any government is, what's the opportunity cost of that? What do we gain by putting that money elsewhere? And of course, part of the answer is the second area of risk, which is around electricity and the restructuring of Eskom and the reform, fundamental and necessary reform of the energy sector. And key to that reform is the Eskom debt, which has weighed as a huge lag factor on this economy, on this government for too long. I think, George, and I'm looking forward to your reaction to this point later in our conversation, but I think it was inevitable that eventually this debt would end up officially and properly on the government's balance sheet, which is what he's effectively announced today, as I understand it. 250 billion rands worth of debt taken on by government. I see that Minister Masondo has joined us. Good afternoon, Mr. Masondo. I can see you're just getting settled. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. George, with your permission, I'm going to go straight to the Minister. I know his time is tight in the immediate aftermath of the budget. You have numerous responsibilities and meetings, and I'm very grateful to you, Minister for Masondo, for joining us. I have to say, as a brief aside, I'd hoped we wouldn't be welcoming you because I'd hoped by now you would have been appointed to a full cabinet position in the reshuffle that we've been waiting for a long time. And I say that with all respect, because you're one of the people in the squad of people the president can choose from, who is a very serious thinker about the most important issues of the day. You give heavy consideration to policy and ideological questions, and I hold you in the highest regard. So I'm very grateful to you for answering our invitation in the affirmative to speak to this audience of Citadel clients who are inevitably concerned about the future of the country and wanting to hear from all of us in terms of the budget. What I just I said, Minister Masondo, and welcome, is as my high-level kind of introductory remarks, I said there were two bold steps taken in this budget, and I'm going to invite you to comment on them. So two questions to you, and then I know George has got a question about greylisting. So let me ask those two questions. The first is around the social wage, and clearly it was a bold decision of the government to decide not to keep the SRD grant, the special grant, but not to increase it, and to save apparently 9 billion Rand from that line item. So there's a cut of 9 billion Rand, as I understand it, from the social grant. That clearly is a risk, because one's reducing the wealth of the poorest members, or some of the poorest members of society. So I'd first of all welcome your comment on that and your thinking in terms of making that choice and making that calculation.
No, thanks, Richard, and thanks for having me, and good afternoon, everyone on the platform. So the sustainability or ability to provide any social wage will depend on the performance of the economy, because our ability to finance the social wage depends on our ability to generate sufficient revenue from the economy. And if the economy is not growing, it's going to be very difficult for us to continuously provide the social wage. And I mean, I'm speaking to people who know this, that even the most advanced social welfare states, their ability to provide the social welfare depends on the ability to grow the economy. So the minister, or we've said in the budget and even in our budget review, that if we are to accommodate demands on this increase on the social wage, it means that we'll have to increase the taxes, because there has to be trade-offs between the provision of the social wage as well as the economic growth, because you don't provide this social wage out of nothing. You do so out of the performance of the economy, because it's out of the good performance of the economy that we are able to generate sufficient revenue to provide the social wage.
Thank you. That's very helpful and very clear, because the minister made reference to tough trade-offs a number of times in the speech, but it wasn't, to my mind, and it may be my mistake, it wasn't always clear what exactly the trade-off was. And I was desperately trying to read through the 280-page full budget review, which is the real meat of the budget, in the run-up to this webinar. And I, as a trained lawyer, I can speed read, but not that fast. So I was still trying to digest all the detail and figure out the trade-offs. So you've identified one, the fact that there are no tax increases, that you've essentially allowed people to keep their earned money in their pocket. The bet, as I understand you, is that those people then will be able to cope with the cost of living increases and continue to spend in the economy, and that will help the economy grow, which will help the fiscus, and then in turn help you with the social wage over the longer term. Am I understanding your thinking correctly, more or less? So,
yes, I think the critical thing is for us to get the economy growing, right? Because once we get the economy growing, it means that there's a good base for tax revenue, because as business invest in the economy, they employ more people. As those more people are getting employed, they pay tax, but they also are in a better position to buy goods and services in the economy, thus enabling us to generate more revenue from that. So I think the critical thing here is to sort out our economy. All those supply side constraints that have made it difficult for us to grow the economy need to be sorted out. Transnet, that is freight, logistics, the supply of energy, the supply of telecommunication, water, skills, and so on. They're quite critical for us to set the necessary conditions for us to generate enough revenue.
Thank you very much. My second question to you, which I'd begun to sort of introduce when you joined the call, was in relation to Eskom. And clearly the energy sector and the electricity issue is a front and center of all of our thinking at the moment, for obvious reasons. So it was important to understand what Treasury was saying about that. What I was suggesting in my remarks was that today was the arrival of the inevitable moment when government accepted fully the Eskom debt onto its balance sheet. Now, that clearly is something that people have expected for a while. I can fully accept and respect the need to do that, and that if it works, will release Eskom from that burden and allow Eskom to move faster and further in unbundling, restructuring, and attracting the investment necessary to do those things. The gamble, and this is my question to you, is that what the minister seemed to be saying was that taking on that debt is coming with conditions. stringent conditions, he said, in relation to how Eskom performs going forward, from management through to its anti-corruption capabilities, its progress in the restructuring and generation capacity, and all of those things. How confident are you that you will be able to hold Eskom to account and hold them to those conditions?
I think, Richard, you're absolutely right. I think the concrete details on the debt takeover of Eskom is one of the biggest highlights of this budget. We're taking 254 billion debt, of which 350 of the 423 billion debt, 350 was guaranteed by the state. So we were simply saying that if this Eskom does not honor its, or is not in a position to honor its debt obligations, the state will come in, and this is what we're basically doing. And you're absolutely right that the logic here is to improve Eskom's balance sheet to enable it to invest in maintenance. Minister Mantashe was also saying that if we're to improve the planned performance of 5 power stations, he mentioned them during the SONA. I think it was Tutuka, Kandal, Duva, Majuba, Kusile, and Matra, that if these power stations were to improve their energy availability factor by over 50%, we probably will be in a better position to end load shedding. So the debt relief that the minister has announced will really play a major role in enabling Eskom to invest in maintenance and improving plant performance. And that's one of the conditions that we've placed before Eskom, that the money that we are basically injecting into Eskom should, of course, go to debt, servicing the debt, both the capital amount as well as the interest payment, and that should enable Eskom, therefore, to invest in maintenance, improving the plant performance of this different power plants that Eskom basically has. And and the conditions are well articulated in what we called a W3 annexure in our budget book, which articulate the conditions that under which we will take on, and money will flow to service the Eskom debt. So we said, amongst other things that Eskom should do, is to invest in the transmission infrastructure, because I think part of the failure of the bid window 5 was the ability of Eskom or our transmission infrastructure to take on the energy generated by the independent power producer. So that's one of the conditions that we are placing before Eskom board, that they need to make sure that this money, unlike in the past where we recapitalized Eskom and we placed conditions, and those conditions were not really adhered to, and this time around we are saying to Parliament that they need to pass a law that also set out the conditions or legalize the conditions between Eskom and South Africa. And this is not going to be conditions between Eskom and Treasury, but it's going to be conditions between Eskom and South Africa, because the Parliament is a tribune of the people. The laws that we pass there, they represent the people of South Africa.
Thank you, David. That's very interesting and very helpful. I think this acronym W3 is going to enter the policy and political discourse in the next couple of years, as we all watch with great interest to see whether Eskom can, now the handbrake has been released, move faster, more effectively, and solve the transmission, generation, and indeed distribution problems it's faced. Let me, as time is short and you need to move on in 5 minutes, let me hand over to you, George, to ask the question I know you have in mind for Minister Masondo. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Minister, good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. Congratulations on a very well balanced budget within a tight context. Your answer to Richard's second question about the importance of growth is absolutely music to my ears, because the only doubt or uncertainty we could literally have on the budget was the growth assumptions that goes into that budget, because that makes everything else work. Fortunately, you have some further playroom with other reserves, so let's leave that there for the time being, but well done on a well-balanced budget. My question to you is, it's about the grey listing. The FATF is about to announce their decision, well, we assume on Friday. And, you know, previously, whenever we asked anybody in government the question, then there was a flurry of detail of what's been happening. But today it was unique because, you know, we know Mr. Minister Gorongwana by now. He joined us on this platform in the previous budget, and he was exceptionally honest and forthright today when he said the words, we should be prepared for that possibility. And that seemed so honest and forthright at the point in time. So plain and simple, what's your thoughts about the chances of us getting grey listed?
George, we should be prepared for any eventuality as the minister. And I think for me, it's what is it that we need to do to get out of grey listing as soon as possible in an eventuality, in an event that we get grey listed. And we are paying attention to how other countries, Turkey, Mauritius, got out of grey listing. And I think at least Parliament, to our credit, to its credit, was able to move in passing, processing different pieces of legislations that were identified as gaps in our ability to fight money laundering, terror financing. So I think for me, we are already ahead of ourselves. They always say the art of politics is always to know what to do next. And I've no doubt in my mind that the measures that we're going to be putting in place to make sure that we correct the or address the deficiencies that have been identified by FATF will be able to do so as soon as possible. And it's unfortunate that the way FATF works, you've got to get 100 out of 100. If they've identified 100 issues, you can get 99. If there's one issue that is not addressed, you've got to get, you're going to get grey listed. And I think for me, it's what do we do post Friday once FATF takes a decision, if in an event they take a decision to grey list us. And as the minister said, that we need to be prepared for that eventuality.
Great answer. Thank you.
Well, I think, George, we should honour our word to allow the minister to move on to his other obligations before past. So we're going to honour our word, Minister Masondo, and release you now, unless there's a last message you'd like to leave the 166 participants of this call ringing in their ears. Anything you'd like to say in leaving us?
I wish I could stay for longer, because I would have loved to hear your views, your thoughts, suggestions, criticism, because we always have our own blind spots as government, and you guys who are active in the our economy and making sure that investment is done to grow our economy, you probably are in a much better position to see what's actually going on in the economy, to give us feedback on how we can improve on the work that we basically do. But Richard, I hope this is not the last engagement. I'm looking forward to the next one. Thank you.
And once again, Treasury, is I think an exemplar. It's as some people may not on this call know, we continue to be in the top 2 of international rankings on budget process and transparency. How the money's then spent is another question, but the Treasury's ability to have a really excellent budget process is one of the institutional excellences of this country, and we're grateful for that. So again, thank you for your time and good luck with the rest of your engagements in this post-budget period. And thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks, colleagues. Have a good one. Bye.
Thank you very much, Richard. I appreciate that you hosted that very productively, and a lot of applause going through on the platform, and well deserved. Dr. Masondo is clearly, as you introduced him, a very competent and capable person. And your thoughts for his future, because you said minister, so you have some plans for him, I presume?
Well, as you know, George, I never make predictions about cabinet reshuffle.
Oh, sorry.
But having said that, what I would say categorically is if there is going to be a reshuffle. If in that reshuffle, Dr. Masondo is not promoted into a full cabinet position, then there's something seriously wrong, because the president has got very scanty resources to play from. His squad is meager, frankly, because he's limited to the benches of the ANC, essentially, in the National Assembly. He's allowed 2 wild cards. One wild card is Enoch Godongwana. I think it's very unlikely he would be moving the Minister for Finance at this delicate moment. The other, of course, is Ibrahim Patel, and that's Patel is a Marmite figure, it seems to me. I've come to realize you either love him or you don't, and I think there is a growing feeling that it's time for a change there, and that would perhaps release a wild card. But Patel has stayed the course and has been a minister now since 2009, remarkably. So that's 14 years in which he has grown his ministry, grown his little empire there. Very diligent minister, full of ideas. And of course, the debate is around his effectiveness and whether those industrial policies that he's so keen on are actually a help or a hindrance to a growing economy. So I think that's one to watch in the reshuffle when it comes. And why it hasn't come yet is a total mystery to me. I'm paid to explain these things, but this is inexplicable, and I find it very hard.
The lack of the reshuffle is a mystery to you, then it's a nightmare to the rest of us.
Well, it's very curious, and it's now reached a point where some of his most loyal, Ramaphosa's most loyal supporters on the top 7 of the ANC, for example, are in private, or not so privately actually, beginning to lament this delay, because it creates a vacuum. And in politics, vacuums are dangerous. People jump into them and are mischievous.
Exactly.
And Minister Mantashe has been controlling the discourse in that vacuum over the last few weeks, not the president. Anyway, let's get back to the budget. Tell me about the market reaction. I'm always fascinated to know how the market reacts. I saw your colleague Martin Ackerman on television earlier with a very smart new tie, I thought, saying that the markets had responded very well. The rand had strengthened during the speech. Explain why that is to me.
Richard, our chief economist, Martin Ackerman, he goes to the budget physically every year, which is great. And he also gets locked up and can only give the info to us after the embargo opens at 2 o'clock. So you study the 284 pages. We get the summary literally at 2 o'clock. And so I was diving into that W3 document, which we'll get to in a moment. The markets took it well for one simple reason. Markets hate uncertainty. And this Eskom debacle and how they would tackle the debt of Eskom was a major uncertainty that's been hanging over the budget for far too long. And today they were crystal clear in how they were going to do that. Now, it's painful, it's probably like having to amputate a limb. You know, it's a horrible decision, but it's probably going to save your life. This Eskom debt deal is exactly that. And so that's why the markets took it kind of positively. The rand strengthened, but just to be fair, it was a lot weaker before. So we traded as high as 1840 and as low as 1810 during the speech. And right now we are back to 1820. So, you know, the rand is very susceptible to the greylisting announcement. And quite frankly, if you interpret what the minister said just now, everything he said was in preparing for what they're going to do afterwards. And on top of that, if you have to score 100, well, we're not going to score 100. There's no ways. So I think he's told us in no uncertain terms that we are going to get grey listed. So the rand will remain under pressure. The bond yields also came somewhat lower. Those are interest rates, because the overall financing picture, although the debt profile increases and looks less positive over the next 3 years because of all the Eskom debt being placed under, the natural dynamics of the budget is actually relatively healthy. And so, you know, the market's taking that number that we go to 73.6 of gross debt to GDP. It kind of took that in its stride, and it took some risk premium out of the bond yields. And so interest rates came a little bit lower. The JSE is not affected by the budget. The JSE was 1% lower today, but that's due to American markets being under pressure. At 9 o'clock tonight, we're waiting for FOMC minutes. Richard, while I am busy talking about the Eskom thing, let's unpack that very quickly. The budget was lucky, the minister was lucky, because since the medium-term budget, they've had excess revenue of 29 billion, and they had fewer expenditures to the tune of 40 billion. Now, usually I'm not positive about that, because those are important things that needed to be done, which wasn't done. That's not the saving, that is poor execution. But in any case, we're talking cash here. So they had 69 billion positive impetus since the previous budget. And this Eskom plan, this debt relief plan, is that they're going to give Eskom 78 billion this year, 66 the year after, 40 the year after, and take on 70 of debt. All of that adds up to the 250. On top of that, Eskom will cancel the 56 billion of municipal debt that they currently have on their books if the municipalities start paying blah, 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 but they have no choice. They're gonna cancel that. So, you know, it feels like horrible that all the scoundrels are getting away with what they did to Eskom. They're getting away with that money because it is all getting written off and it's all coming out of the sovereign balance sheet. But it leaves Eskom with an improved balance sheet, which allows them to use their cash flow, their natural cash flow, to affect maintenance, to expand the transmission network. And you combine that with the new generation capacity that mostly private sector is bringing online, we could look at a situation 3 years from now where load shedding is behind us. And I think every single one of us would be pleased if we can have that outcome. So the minister is taking a 250 billion rand bet that this solution will solve the load shedding problem. Your question was brilliant, because you said, what are the risks that those conditions don't eventuate? And you spot on right, and we're going to follow that every time as we go along. But for now, that was the biggest number. So they saved 69 billion in the previous budget, and they're spending 78 right now more on bailing out Eskom just this year. And in essence, those two big numbers, in your beginning comments, you mentioned your social payment of 9 billion that wasn't going to take place. Now you can see where that 9 billion disappeared to, because they were already 9 short just by that single trade. But everything else in the budget becomes squeezed to nothing because of this enormous elephant in the room that had to be sorted out. And so there was no further tax increases, tax bracket creep, all of that was taken care of. We can talk about that if you like. But that was the main issue, the Eskom issue. And that was this W3 annexure that they added to the budget. And as I mentioned, they had an online meeting immediately after with National Treasury and senior Eskom executives, who were very impressive, by the way, in talking about these numbers, how they'd be used, the conditions attached to them, talking to the international investment community. And that was very heartening listening to that, I must tell you.
Well, George, thank you. Very fascinating analysis from you. I'm learning as I listen, and various points arise, several of them. The first is, of course, the point I made in bidding the minister farewell, which is that Treasury remains and continues to be an institutional stronghold in our government. And of course, that's welcome for numerous reasons. And although there's been some change and turnover in terms of the people in Treasury, it seems that its institutional capability is remaining. And of course, when one thinks about what the budget is the other side of the coin of SONA. SONA is supposed to set out government strategy, and the budget's supposed to tell you how it's going to be paid for. Increasingly, particularly with this president who doesn't like making tough strategic choices, frankly, and is something of a coward because he can't confront them or appears unable to. It's then left to the body that has to figure out how stuff's going to be paid for to make those strategic trade-offs. And in effect, that's what we saw today. We saw, and we've seen this, I think, in recent years, increasingly, the state of the nation moving into the budget because the budget has to make those trade-offs. And the big bet was we're going to risk socioeconomic precarity. We're going to save money there. And I think when we go through the budget review, we'll find plenty of other places in social expenditure where money's been saved in order to ensure that taking on the debt of Eskom does not create too big a burden over the next 3 or 4 years. It is a big additional debt burden, but it was inevitable. And I'm sure markets have factored that in. Markets wanted that because markets, of course, want, as investors do, and as I think we all do, we want Eskom to be able to do the job. And the question is, will they? And of course, the big concern is that the corruption and the incapability has not yet been driven out of state-owned enterprises in general, and Eskom particularly. You know, why else is De Ruyter leaving? He's leaving partly because he's sick and tired of policy uncertainty and political arguments in cabinet and the inability of the president to resolve them. But I think he's also leaving because he's tired and exhausted by his own organization. So there is a worry, and that's why those W3 document conditions are going to be so important in the next 2 to 3 years to see if Eskom is going to yield the results of this big bet. I think that's very important. The last point I wanted to make, again, a point about institutional capability. The last year you had, yes.
Maybe if I may interrupt you, keep that.
Please.
I'll tell you why. A naughty question by a guy came in just now, and it was on the point that you made just now. So I want to bring it in here right away, and I want to invite people, if you have any questions, pop it down into the Q&A box. And we'll try and handle it right there and then. But Guy comes in with a naughty question because there was an interview by Mr. De Ruyter on ETV, and he made some explosive statements in that. To your point that you made just now, interesting, much of it has been removed this afternoon. So, Guy, if you ask me, is it true or sour grapes? Yes, the interview is very true. It did take place. And Mr. De Ruyter did say what is captured in the text. Some of the videos has since disappeared. But Richard, I think just to capture that point of yours, it is crystal clear that not nearly all the facts are out in the open yet. And as Mr. De Ruyter leaves, unfortunately, some further dirt will come out during this process. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. Sorry.
That's absolutely right, George. And you will recall, I think, that where we had Pravin Gordhan speaking to an audience of Citadel people in person prior to COVID, it was 6 months into the new Ramaphosa administration, I think in October 2018. And Mr. Gordhan admitted to me in that discussion I had with him in front of a Citadel audience that he had discovered things were far worse than he had expected when he came into the Ministry of Public Enterprises. In other words, the rot had run very deep in Eskom and in Transnet and elsewhere. Cleaning it out is proving to be a big job, a long job. And that's why the risk factor is you release the handbrake on Eskom, but the assumption is that it will be able to drive fast and in the straight line. and not go off the road because people there are corrupt or have got vested interests, or continuing to rent seek. And that's a hugely important consideration.
That's why I couldn't make the comment now as well. He says Eskom today with zero debt is no more capable than Eskom yesterday. I think on the face, that statement, nobody can argue that. But if we had to start somewhere, then at least you have to release the handbrake. You have to clear up the balance sheet. So it is a gamble. It's a costly gamble.
Yes, and the government by stealth, George, is privatizing Eskom. Let's be clear about that. No one dares use the word privatization. It's always dressed up as restructuring or unbundling or whatever. But it is a major structural reform of the most important part of our economy. And it's happening under Ramaphosa. It's not happening fast enough. It's not happening decisively enough because of his weaknesses in his leadership. But it is happening. And it's going to gather pace for various different reasons, including the climate finance investment from international donors. And because of the necessity of the energy crisis, I think does propel us forward. The last point I wanted to make was about the institutional capability of SARS. So the bonus last year, it was the commodity boom. There was extra money that gave Minister Gondwana a bit of headroom that he didn't think he was going to have. This year, it was the fact that they had perhaps deliberately underestimated revenue from tax collection, and it was much higher, and therefore there was additional cash from that. That is a reflection, as the minister basically said, of the increasing capability of SARS again. So this is a very simple thing of appointing the right person as the head of that body, Edward Kieswetter, and Kieswetter is doing an excellent job at rebuilding what was a great institution when, in fact, Pravin Gordhan was the Commissioner of Revenue during the 2000s. So, it's very easy to criticize Ramaphosa, and I've become very frustrated by him, having been a champion of his for a long time. But overall, the Ramaphosa administration continues to improve things steadily. We're in a better position than we would have been had he not embarked on these various reforms and good appointments.
Point taken. However, I go on to the entire budget speech and do word search for Transnet. Wasn't mentioned once. And so we sit here today and we have this good feeling that maybe we've started the solution of Eskom, but we haven't started with Transnet yet, and that is another problem. All our network businesses, those things that act as the DNA of our economy, is not acting the way that it should. But Richard, I've got two more comments that I want to make. I mean, the Eskom one, whether you're positive or negative is not the issue from a financial perspective. From a market's perspective, it has removed some risk and uncertainty from the financial equation, and hence why it was received relatively well. We think that the greylisting announcement is probably more of a risk to the markets right now, specifically to the rand and to the bond markets. Both of those have priced in a lot of risk premium over the last while. Bond yields are higher by a good 60-70 basis points, and the rand has essentially gone from 17 to 18 just on the back of this risk. Foreigners, by the way, have sold 35 billion rand worth of South African bonds in the first 3 weeks of February. So they're voting with their feet in terms of that. Two more things I would like to highlight out of this budget, which is crucial. I touched on the one to the minister, is that the Reserve Bank came out with their expected South African GDP number for 2023, and they reduced that to 0.3. And in fact, with load shedding the way that it's going now, even that number seems to be optimistic. So let's call it our economy is going to kind of flatline for this year, considering the energy crisis, in the context of a global slowdown as well. Now, in this budget, the growth number that was imputed in the assumptions was 0.9% for this year and 1.4% on average for the next 2 years. That is quite a rosy picture in the very, very short term. Now, quite frankly, you take that 0.9 down to the Reserve Bank 0.3, or to, let's call it just a zero number for 2023. And unfortunately, none of these numbers that we spoke about now, which kind of feels comfortable, none of them balance. We come out a lot shorter. So that's the first thing. And the second variable.
George, can I interrupt you? Sorry, can I interrupt you on that? Because I think this is really important. And what my researcher, Mike Law, picked up, and you know he's a sharp young man, he said that the answer to why the growth forecast is 3 times that of the Reserve Bank is that it's based on the high road scenario from last year, where load shedding was, quote, eliminated this year. So that strikes one as a very flaky basis for such a kind of projection, does it not?
Absolutely. So it's a bit of a media statement if you say it's 3 times more. Well, it's 0.3 versus 0.9, so mathematically it is. But let's understand these are small numbers we're talking about. So yes, that is a high road scenario, and you know as well as I do, we're not on that high road scenario at all. So we are highlighting immediately the risk that these numbers will not be achieved. And the second reason why it won't be achieved is because the public wage public sector wage number in the previous budget that was imputed in these numbers is 3.3% increase. That ends this year, and then on the 3-year rollover, the government has now offered them 4.7, and they've come back with their opening bid at 12.5. So it doesn't matter what it is, we're going to end up at a number higher than 3.3, there's no doubt. So with 3.3 inside this budget, we know it's going to be a higher number than that, and the budget's very sensitive to that number. It's a very large number. So unfortunately, both the growth number and the public sector wage number, no doubt will place some further pressure onto this budget. And so we're going to need some tailwinds from strong commodity prices or something, externally. We need some exports to get going. If we can get some of these initiatives of the president of less red tape, if we can get Transnet, all our export companies are complaining that they have the stuff to export, but they can't get it to the ports. If we can literally just get the basic logistics sorted out and get exports going, there's a good chance that we can actually then achieve those numbers. But unfortunately, those blockages will have to be taken out. I see there's another question of will the billions owing to Eskom still be chased up? Well, it seems like the largest number of what is owed to Eskom is by municipalities. And in this discussion by National Treasury and Eskom around their financial situation, it was made pretty clear that most of that municipal debt will be written off over time if those municipalities actually start paying their current bills. So that's a big if. So to answer your question, it seems like, yes, it will be written off. Now, that irritates all of us and adds to the frustration of this problem. And Richard, maybe then back to you. I mean, I started in my intro, this is what's been the narrative for a while now, is what is described as a crisis of confidence, because the average man in the street, the consumer, the small and medium business driver, feels that the government's not going anywhere and not solving this energy crisis, and we're getting suffocated economically from that perspective. What do you think it'll take for that crisis of confidence to improve?
Yes, it's a very, very important question. There's a credibility gap, and I think many people from different sectors, different parts of society share that fear or that feeling that whatever the government says, whatever the president states in the State of the Nation just isn't going to happen for one reason or another. And the kind of credibility gap, to my mind, yawns greater when you hear Treasury through the Minister of Finance speaking really so coherently and with such impeccable logic in some respects. You see the rationale and the reasonableness of their decision making. You can debate it, of course, but there's real method there, and one has to admire that. But the problem is that, and one can say this, one has said it the last few years, that what they say and what they want and what will happen, unfortunately, is the credibility gap. And our conversation about Eskom earlier is the prime example of that. And you've just painted a picture, George, which I was admiring of how certain things could fall into place now. We fix this, we fix that. We all know there are investors circling this economy, desperate to get in. They see real opportunity in the energy sector in particular. They're just waiting for the sort of ducks to align, and they'll pounce. But we need that those ducks to be in line, and that requires the government to be just that bit more decisive and clear about what it's doing. I see there's another question, George, there that must be for you, because I don't know what it means, because it says impact on your house view.
Yes, indeed. Kun is asking all the smart questions here tonight. Kun, our house view has been for this period where we're in now, that global growth is slowing down. We think that developed markets specifically are only going to run at 50% of their capacity growth for the next 18 months. And that places growth assets or equities, risk assets under pressure. Earnings will be scarce in a slower growth environment. And then if you look at the efficient frontier of all the different asset classes relative to each other, with interest rates that have risen a lot, bond yields that are a lot higher, suddenly the fixed income complex and all the alternatives relative to risk assets and specifically equities, that efficient frontier is now flat. You essentially get the same expected return for the same risk. No, I'm sorry, you get the same expected return, but the risk in equity assets are far higher than in fixed income assets. So right now, the investment world is tilted towards, we should be leaning into fixed income investments. Our problem is that in South Africa, we couldn't do that until this grey listing is sorted out, because it is a high risk event for the South African bond market. But to answer that, no, this doesn't bring about any changes to our house view. We are very defensive and concerned about where the world is going in the next 12 months, and we would use opportunities to buy fixed income and defensive assets during this whole period. So no major changes from this. Richard, yeah, a lot of people saying comments that we throw a lot of money at things, but we don't fix it. Can't argue that, that's true, but it's at least a good start. Richard, in terms of, post-Sona, do you get the sense that if we have this reshuffle, we could find some momentum building and things getting a bit more positive?
Well, the reshuffle is essential now, and the delay, which is already unjustified and unhelpful, has to be brought to an end. And if the president doesn't deliver a reshuffle, even allowing for the fact that it's going to be very constrained. So I'm not in any way suggesting, George, that this reshuffle is going to provide a magical solution. People need to be, as I said on radio earlier, be prepared to be greatly underwhelmed by it. So none of you should have huge expectations because of the constraints, but there are things he can do, and there are positions that he can clarify. And of course, what is even more mystifying, or just as mystifying, as the failure to organize the cabinet and to appoint a minister for electricity, having with great fanfare announced this new ministry in the presidency, he has of course not appointed anyone to it. So we're none the wiser as to what really the role is, because in politics you see the position, and then when you see the appointee, you then join the dots and figure out what's really going on. As I understand it, having spoken to the president's advisors, the job is a coordination job. The minister will do what the president is apparently incapable of doing, which is to get his ministers to work together across ministries, across departments, to fix a crisis. And that will be the coordination role of that minister when he or she is finally appointed. The other mystery is you announce a state of disaster and the State of Nation address, but legally it's completely meaningless until you, by law, announce the regulations that give effect to that state of disaster. So again, 2 weeks have gone by. We've got a state of disaster announced by the president, but it's legally meaningless. So this is peculiar. Let's be clear about it. So those things have to be taken care of in the next couple of weeks, I hope. That will bring bigger clarity. And then very soon, George, we're going to be into election campaigning. And our political direction is going to switch to the parties and to campaigning, and then, of course, to what will be a watershed election next year, 2024, when the ANC will very probably lose its majority.
Richard, well, I look forward to mine and your further discussions come that time. In terms of today's budget, quite a few smaller initiatives and moves, things about, you know, your solar and blah, blah, blah. It's decent for businesses. 125% of total cost can be deducted from taxable income over the next 2 years. For private individuals, it's minor, 25% of what you pay for solar panels to a maximum of 15,000. So that's really minor. Unfortunately, it's not going to affect the people who are affected the most by the lack of electricity, which is really a pity. But in any case, that plus all the other small detail around tax, of which there weren't major shifts, will be published by our fiduciary team very shortly, probably later this evening or by tomorrow morning at the latest, I imagine. But there wasn't anything major there. So in terms of this budget, I think we can say that it was an unsurprising budget, one with a few assumptions in it, which we'll have to see how it plays out. But it was good to see Mr. Minister Gorongwana and Mr. Masondo in person today, and very competent people. And as long as they stay around, I think in the global context, financial markets will still support the South African financial markets, which is a good thing. So I don't think there's any negativity from that. Richard, for the conversation, as always, engaging and great having you. Thank you very much for joining us. Everybody for joining us. Speak to you soon. Thank you very, very much.
Thank
Cheers.
you, George. Thank you to everyone on the webinar.
Bye-bye.
All the